Welcome to Exploration Dreamland, a quiet read aloud of the writings of explorers of the real world and the worlds of imagination. Drop anchor, relax into your comfortable bunk, and drift off to Dreamland with us as we read a lightly edited version of Cave Regions of the Ozarks and Black Hills by Luella Agnes Owen, published in 1898. The book will be read in order, so if you would like to begin at the beginning, please start with Season 3, Episode 44. Content note: if by some chance you feel inspired to investigate any locations mentioned, please keep in mind that they may not be currently accessible to the public. Some are operated as commercial caves and have been noted as such where appropriate. This book was written quite some time ago and therefore does not necessarily reflect current-day outlooks and language choices. The scientific texts may use outdated terminology or be inaccurate in light of more recent discoveries. This podcast was created primarily to help you relax and to entertain you. The texts are chosen for their ability to charm and interest you, rather than for educational purposes. If you would like to stay in touch between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at Exploration Dreamland. If you have a moment to leave us a review on iTunes, it would help other listeners find us. You can also hear our episodes on YouTube. If you are listening there, please like our episodes and leave a comment for us. We'd love to hear from you. Now, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, relax any tension in your muscles. Close your eyes, snuggle into your sleeping space, and listen to tonight's tale. Chapter 14, Crystal Cave. A quick note from your host in 2023. We believe this cave is now known as Wonderland Cave, and it is usually open to the public from May through October. South Dakota can boast of yet another cave in the Black Hills that was formed by volcanic disturbance of the rocks and afterwards decorated in a manner peculiar to itself. This is Crystal Cave. It is 9 miles from Piedmont in the eastern edge of the hills, and easily visited from that point by way of the narrow gauge road, which winds along the natural curves of the beautiful Elk Creek Canyon, whose walls are said to expose a depth of almost a mile of geological strata, although the exposure at any one point does not exceed 300 feet. The disappointment of not having seen this cave during the summer visit to the hills grew as the weeks passed, and a request that the owner should send a description was answered with an assurance that it was impossible. Therefore, on Friday, November 13th, 1896, with a small nephew, Herbert A. Owen, Jr., for company, the trip was undertaken a second time to complete the unfinished mission. The first glimpse of the hills is at Edgemont in the early morning, but the train makes its way to the north through the heart of the uplift, twisting about the curves of the hills and clinging to the sides of a beautiful canyon whose high walls give way here and there to fine slopes densely covered with forests of pine and spruce. These look black in the distance, which apparently suggested the name of Black Hills to the Native Americans. There are great tracts where fire has killed part or all of the timber, but left much of it standing, while in other places nature has defied the power of fire and the hills are reclothed with young trees. A recent storm had further beautified the region with a few inches of snow, but as the day advanced, a chinook began to blow so that when Deadwood was reached soon after noon, only the northern exposures retained an appearance of winter. Deadwood is a most peculiar little city, and very attractive in its peculiarity, being crowded snugly into a depression between a number of steep pine-wooded hills, which gives an appearance suggestive of a bird's nest securely located among the forks of a branching tree. And as is the case in a nest, business is chiefly transacted at the lowest depth of the enclosure. As the busy center of a great gold-mining region, the metropolis of the hills, and the outgrowth of an exciting historical past, it claims and receives interesting attention. And while the whole Black Hills region is still distinctly a man's country, it is called woman's paradise, and surely nowhere else are the daughters of Eve received with a more gracious courtesy, or surrounded by an equally unobtrusive protecting care. The streets leading up to the residences lack very little of standing on end, and the houses appear to have been hung in place by means of hooks and wire cord, like pictures on a wall. The smelter has no reception day, but admits visitors as if their pleasure were a guarantee of profit. The finest scenery in the hills is said to be that of the Spearfish Canyon, north of Deadwood, and the finest of that at the falls, but this may be doubtful, as other points are very beautiful, especially where the Burlington and Missouri Road requires a distance of 7 miles to climb the canyon wall. Piedmont being the nearest town to Crystal Cave, we took the early evening train on the Elkhorn Road and soon were located, and shocked to learn that the proprietor of the cave had started several days before to drive to Wind Cave for specimens. The cave was closed and no one there. The trip had been taken for the one purpose of exploring Crystal Cave, and a letter sent in advance to announce our coming, but the train carrying it was an hour late, so he drove off without the mail. There seemed at first nothing to be done but take the next returning train, which, under the circumstances, was objectionable. A night's rest and a telegram that had to be sent 12 miles by special messenger improved the situation. The proprietor was unavoidably detained at Wind Cave, but secured a reliable guide, expressed me the cave keys, and has since married the specimen he had gone in quest of. May great happiness dwell at the cave many years. The morning of the 3rd day after our arrival found arrangements all complete, and soon after the train left Piedmont, it entered Elk Creek Canyon, which is always beautiful, but on that morning was exceptionally so, on account of a sudden change in the weather having covered every visible portion of the passing landscape with heavy frost. The trees on distant hills that ordinarily are black were, for once, all softly white, and when the tall pines in the canyon were shaken by a breeze, they cast a shower of flakes like snow. Here the canyon walls are in Carboniferous limestone with a pleasing variety of color in the strata and the erosion carving not overdone, the most notable piece being the knife blade. This, at first view, appears to be a high round tower, but the train following the curve reveals the fact that it is not a tower, but a thin, curved knife blade. The sun just for one instant shone through a rift in the clouds and added special charm to the scene. A short distance beyond is Crystal Cave Station, where the guide was waiting to take us in charge. He is an intelligent young man who has served an enlistment term in the army, is recently married, very obliging, and proud of being trustworthy. The scenery here is most beautiful as well as grand. The canyon makes a sharp turn toward the south, and on the north opens out into another canyon of even greater beauty and higher walls, the perpendicular being 300 feet in places. Crystal Cave is in the hill embraced by the junction curve. The natural entrance is more than 200 feet above the canyon bed and was naturally approached from above. A short walk up the North Canyon, whose name has unfortunately slipped away, was over ice and snow the Chinook failed to reach, and brought us to a long stairway against the wall, which affords a more direct approach than nature gave, and is a fair test of physical perfection. Finally, a resting place is reached where the grandeur of the view can be enjoyed, and then a shorter stairway completes the ascent of the wall, but not of the hill, so there is still a considerable upward walk through the forest of tall pines, all carpeted with brilliant mats of kinnikinick, with its shining leaves, glowing in shades of green and red, trying to rival the bright scarlet berries. The kinnikinick here resembles the wintergreen of the east, while in the mountains in Colorado it grows in the form of a shrub 2 to 3 feet in height, but with no variation in the leaf or berry. At last perseverance is rewarded with a view of the cave buildings and the summit of the hill rising yet higher beyond, and tall straight pines swaying in the rising wind over all. One of the 2 houses was entered and preparations quickly made for entering the cave, the artificial tunnel entrance being only a little distance further on. The door was unlocked, candlesticks taken from a shelf within, candles from the guide's supply lighted, and we went forward at last into Crystal Cave. At the end of the new tunnel, a second door was passed through, which is locked on the inside during the visiting season by the last guide to enter, in order that no chance late arrival may enter alone and be lost. The first room is a small one at the junction of the natural and artificial entrances, from which we go upstairs to the resting room in the highest level of the cave, and perfectly dry, but otherwise of no special interest. After a short rest here, we went downstairs at the side opposite that on which we entered, into a passage leading to the cave's first beauty, the Red Room. As the name indicates, the walls are vividly colored and represent the uncertain line which separates the Carboniferous strata from the Triassic rocks. The color is handsomely brought out here in contrast with masses of calcite crystal, so as to present by the combination a charmingly beautiful room from which we retired, feet first, down a squeeze to the bridal chamber, where we found ourselves perched on an irregular narrow ledge, high up on the wall, and cherishing a private conviction that exploration had met a checkmate. But the guide reached the floor, and my nephew, Herbert, scrambled down with as much ease as the chipmunk he had chased to the housetop a while before. So a little application settled the difficulty and reunited the party. The room is an artistic study in red, and the only reason for its being called the bridal chamber is that the way out is decidedly more rough and difficult than by which the entrance is effected. This, however, is an observation not based on official information. Off to one side of this room is Lost Man's Paradise, also in red and crystal, named in honor of the timely rescue of one who had faced the possibility of becoming a lost soul. Another Fat Man's Misery on a lower level leads from the bridal chamber to the big dome, a large room with a fine dome-shaped ceiling from which heavy masses of crystals have fallen to the floor. And down a steep incline from here is Reef Rock, an immense fallen rock with boxwork on the underside, which at one time served to ornament the ceiling, and now this rock marks the beginning of Poverty Flat, a broad, low passage of great extent that has been robbed of all its wonderful treasure of crystal and ends in a steep, rough declivity named Bunker Hill by the guides who dreaded to mount it when going out loaded with specimens. At the foot of the hill is a boulder of enormous size and with a pointed top, known as Pyramid Rock, and giving the same name to the large room in which it stands. Every portion of Crystal Cave has at one time been heavily crusted with calcite crystals, mainly of the dog-tooth variety, and any barren places are so either because the surface has been removed for specimens or thrown down by the violence of an earthquake. But where the latter has been the cause of removal, the crystals have in most cases been renewed, which is amply evidenced by the fallen masses being crystallized on all sides. And these, as well as most of the walls, are not covered thinly with one crust, but layer has been added to layer until the thickness is 4 to 10 inches, and often more. The ceilings that have been denuded by nature's forces during the same early period when water filled the cave were also renewed. From the pyramid room, a narrow fissure forms a passage to the cactus chamber, where there is a marvelous floor on which the crystals are in bunches like cacti, and the beautiful ceiling is the finest and most irregular unbroken mass of crystal yet seen. Passing through a round hole known as the Needle's Eye, we enter Statuary Hall, where the latest inrush of water has eroded the sharp points from the crystals, leaving only smooth surfaces, and at the same time done much curious carving, the most conspicuous pieces of this work being a bear and the heads of a Native American and his baby. Out from the hall are two important routes, one down the steep incline of Beaver's Slide to the catacombs, and another, which we followed first, is through Rocky Run, a rough and rocky pass to a large and handsomely crystallized chamber called the IXL room, on account of those 3 letters, over 12 inches in height, being distinctly and conspicuously worked in crystal on a magnificent piece of boxwork that would weigh nearly half a ton, for which an offer of $500 is said to have been refused. A note from your host in 2023, this would equate to approximately $3,600 currently. The next chamber beyond is Tillotson Hall, very large and extremely rough, and named in honor of a teacher from the normal school who delivered an address here that gave much pleasure to both visitors and guides. The way to farther advance is now more difficult and through a jagged crevice of threatening appearance, but the trip is made in safety and with comparative ease, and brings us into Notre Dame, one of the largest chambers in the cave, and perhaps the finest, although where so much is fine, that may be uncertain. The display of boxwork and crystal is sufficiently gorgeous to do honor to the famous old cathedral of France, the ceiling especially being a masterpiece of the builder's and decorator's arts. But the grandest portion, which a visitor recently returned from foreign travel called the Russian Castle, on account of the magnificence of the large boxwork and pearly crystal masses, should rather be known as the great cathedral's crowning glory, the altar. Another large room, the handsome council chamber, is entered just as that altar of pearl is lost to view, and from there an uphill trip is taken through a narrow crevice to Whale Flat, which is the natural history room, with a large whale as the show specimen. Going out from here, we enter another crevice which serves as a steep stairway descending to a lower level, and measures from top to bottom 118 feet. This is called Rip Van Winkle's stairway, and although merely a high and crooked crack in the rock, is very beautiful because heavily coated with crystal, the effect being especially striking at the top where the crystal is partly worn away and leaves exposed patches of red rock. At the foot of the stairway is the first room containing water, and is called the camp. It is the most charming chamber yet visited, with not the smallest spot of plain or common rock visible. The ceiling, walls, floor, and groups of fallen rocks, unbroken masses of pearly calcite in crystals of varied sizes, with here and there a patch coated over with pure white carbonate of lime, or supporting a bunch of fragile eggshell, which is a thin hollow crust of lime carbonate, almost invariably having the pointed form of the dog-tooth spar. And there are also beautiful mats and banks of dainty white carbonate flowers. While waiting here for the guide to go in quest of the lunch we had carelessly left behind, the time was utilized in measuring the room, which is a small one. The size of the cave and our limited time for seeing it prevented much desired measurements from being taken in all parts of the cave. This room was found to be 48 feet long. The irregular width varied from 14 to 30 feet, and the height from 4 1/2 to 10 feet. The crystal water basin is especially beautiful, and the water so clear that we stood looking into it with disappointment, being thirsty and thinking it dry, until the guide laughingly dipped and offered a cupful. The basin is the segment of a circle rounding beneath a massive, overhanging crystal ledge of wonderful beauty, and is 9 feet long by 2 in width. This room and the stairway into it are alone worthy of a visit, but there is much that is finer still. Out of the camp, by way of Gunnysack Kraal, so named by the workmen who spread gunny sacks to relieve the torture of crawling over the beautiful floor of sharp crystals, we enter the first chamber, where active operation is still maintained, and certain branches of the great decorative industry of the cave may be carefully studied. This operative chamber, which is unnamed, would no doubt be called a factory in the East, but in its own locality would more likely be referred to as the works. The next chamber entered is Crystal Flat, whose floor is completely covered with immense crystal blocks, and the wonderful crystal ceiling is exceedingly fine. But time being limited, we must pass on into the lake room, where is Crystal Lake, the largest body of water in the cave. It is about 30 feet long by 15 wide, and its greatest depth is said to be 10 feet. The water is cold and clear, and the goldfish introduced as an experiment 3 years ago are said to have grown rapidly, but not yet turned white, and are not known to have become blind. At some little distance from Crystal Lake, and not within the same range of vision, although in the same room, is Dry Lake, which, to the surprise of the guide, we found to be not dry, but full of limpid water, through which we could distinctly see the delicate clusters of crystals it is depositing. They are of a pale honey yellow and are called gumdrops on account of the resemblance to that variety of confection. The name Dry Lake was given because in blasting out a passage, a misdirected shot went through the bottom of the lake, which in consequence was soon drained. But the heavily charged water has sealed up the unfortunate break and resumed its interrupted work. The ceiling drops to a height of little more than 3 feet directly above the lake margin, and is a beautiful crystal mass, which at a little distance down the sloping floor appears as the background for a fine piece of cave statuary called the Bridal Veil, and formed of cream-tinted dripstone. Not a great deal of imagination is required to see a girlish figure completely enveloped in the flowing folds of a wedding veil that falls lightly about her feet. The figure itself is 3 feet 10 inches in height and stands on an almost flat circular base of the same material that measures 9 inches in depth and 2 feet 8 inches in diameter. At times the water rises sufficiently to cover the base, in proof of which it left a fringe-like border of small, sharp crystals, such as could be formed only beneath the water's surface. Most of this border has, unfortunately, been chiseled off for specimens, but will be renewed in time if left undisturbed, and that condition can easily be secured with a few feet of wire netting. To one side of this room is a most daintily beautiful alcove, so profusely decorated with fragile forms of dripstone that a passage through it without causing damage is extremely difficult. This alcove is about 25 feet in either direction, with a sloping floor almost covered with stalagmitic growths above the earlier deposit of sharp crystals, and many of these rise in slender columns to the glass-like ceiling, which varies in height from 3 to 6 feet and is thickly studded with small stalactites of both varieties, the pointed solid form and those of uniform size which are always hollow like a pipe stem. The central ornament is the chimes, a musical group of stalactites which is scarcely more beautiful than Cleopatra's Needle, at a distance of a few feet to one side, a transparent column 4 feet in height and having an average circumference of 17 inches. The abode of the fairies is a similar, though smaller, room, with the Tower of Babel for a handsome showpiece. While this portion of the cave is extremely attractive, the measurements given show that in comparison with caves of other states, the drip deposit here is too small to be reckoned an important feature in itself. But in conjunction with the miles of calc-spar that give the cave a character distinctly its own, it well repays all attention. Leaving Lake Room, we enter a newly opened, long, dry passage to Slab Room, where a comparatively recent earthquake has shaken down the ornamental ceiling and spread it in great slabs over the floor. And having since remained perfectly dry, it has the appearance of being the work of yesterday. This room is remembered as the one in which a party of workers were lost, and one of their number gave a severe nervous shock to the junior proprietor by suggesting that as he was acting as guide and unable to lead them out, it was only right that he should be the first victim to satisfy their hunger. A rescuing party with extinguished candles was listening behind a rock to the blood-curdling speech and came forward to restore cheerfulness. A long, irregular, frosty-looking crevice called Jack Frost Streak conducts us from Slab Room and ends at Mold Ladder, on which we pause to admire a wonderful growth of snow-white cave vegetation before ascending into Santa Claus's Pass, the longest passage in the cave. It is a rough crevice named from the fact of being discovered on Christmas Eve, and ends at the Government Room, on the main tourist route, where a U.S. pack saddle and apparently portable bathtub are conspicuous. Next beyond is a very large room named New Zealand, on account of its icy appearance and the undisputed possession of a seal. This room, in turn, opens into Mold Chamber, where an old board platform, formerly used for the display of specimens, has fostered the most marvelously beautiful growth of mold. It hangs in ropes 5 and 6 feet long with tasseled ends and in broad looped draperies, but is most beautiful where it has taken possession of the rocks and spreads out on the flat surface like large open fans with deep, soft feather borders. Having been in the cave 8 hours, we now followed the outward passage from Mold Chamber and soon reached an open trap door, where the guide suggested to Herbert that he would be afraid to go down alone and allow him to close the door. But the child surprised him by quietly stepping down and then asking why he wished it, only to be told, because we are coming too. Which we did, and found ourselves in the main entrance passage, and in due time returned to the outer world, where a terrific wind was roaring through the tall pines, and the early winter evening had already closed in dark. The guide locked the cave, walked with us to the house where he lighted a lamp and left us to prepare for the return to town. But the lamp, belonging to a bachelor, was empty, so we made our preparations in imitation of the blind. On the guide's return, he lighted a candle, but suggested that 20 minutes were generally allowed for reaching the station. The house was accordingly closed, and as we walked down the long curving slope to the stairway, he told of a new and unknown bob-tailed wolf that has recently made its first appearance among the hills in considerable numbers, and to the terror of stalk. It attacks and bites horses or cattle, and after waiting for the fatal poison inflicted to take effect, falls to and eats the victim. The uncovered platform, which serves as a station, being reached a few minutes before the train arrived, I expressed an unwillingness to detain our guide longer on account of his having a walk of 4.5 miles to his home, but he declined to consider the subject, saying he had been directed not to leave us until we were taken safely on the train, which came sweeping round the curve on time and stopped for us. Stay tuned for the next segment from Cave Regions of the Ozarks and Black Hills by Luella Agnes Owen. Please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Keep in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, and recommend us to anyone you know who could use a quiet break or a little help falling asleep. Exploration Dreamland is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Sarah Vanzaley. A big thank you to Project Gutenberg for helping me find many interesting publications. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for providing the theme music for this show. The title of this piece is Kalimba Relaxation Music, if you would like to visit his website to hear it in its entirety. Sweet dreams.